Good morning, students. Hope all is well with you. This lecture is for April 6th or 7th, whichever class you happen to be in. As we left off with our last lecture, we discussed the end of World War II. And of course, with the end of World War II, basically two superpowers arose in the world. They had been allies during the war, but that quickly fell apart. And when I say fell apart, I mean literally fell apart. It started collapsing actually before the war was even over. During the spring and summer of 45, that alliance just totally fell apart. What happened is two intense rivals emerged in the world. They could not bridge their ideological differences over basic issues such as human rights, individual liberties, democratic elections, and even religious freedom. And as a result, they were basically like two crouched animals ready to pounce on one another at the drop of a pin. But some other things happen. After the war, we see an eruption of anti-colonial liberation movements in Asia, in Africa, and in the Middle East that would soon strip Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and even the United States of their global empires. In other words, the age of imperialism of the late 19th century unravels during the mid-20th century. For example, Philippines will gain its independence from the United States in 1946. The next year, Great Britain will withdraw from Hindu-dominated India. And, of course, in 1949, then we have the emergence of communist China, and this just further complicates the global policies and the dynamics of the Cold War. So, instead of World War II ending and bringing a sense of stability, World War II ends, and instability is what is brought into the world. Now, when Roosevelt died, and of course, sadly, he did not get to see the Allied victory, Truman was kind of a clumsy speaker. He lacked Roosevelt's dash and charm. He resembled Andrew Jackson in his decisiveness and bluntness and folksy manner and raw courage. And he was a feisty individual who was able to rise above his limitations. Well, as I mentioned, the Soviet Union begins to gobble up some of those Eastern European nation states and says they want to form a buffer between them and Germany. No, what the Soviets really wanted to do was have world dominance. They wanted to extend their notion of nationship to as many places in the world as they possibly could. And of course, the U.S. began to quickly realize that the Soviet Union wanted to dominate the world. And so the U.S. was forced into a position that we are going to have to stand against this. As leader of the, quote, free world, the U.S. had to assume the responsibility of supporting freedom-loving nations wherever they were. And so, as the Soviet Union seeks to spread its dominance, the U.S. kind of takes on the role as being a worldwide policeman, if necessary. So America's traditional commitment to capitalism, political self-determination, religious freedom conflicted dramatically with what was going on in the Soviet Union. And so there was a lot of insecurity as communist ideology drove many nations almost into paranoia. So the U.S., rather than retreating to isolationism, is going to assume a permanent global mission. And it also abandoned the idea that tanks would become cars once again. And this was the logical outcome of the Monroe Doctrine. It was hoped after the war that instead of manufacturing military goods, the United States would be able to totally shift back to a civilian type of economy. But obviously, the Soviets were going to make sure that did not happen. As a result of this great division that begins to rise, Churchill, our great British spokesman, declares that an iron curtain has been drawn in Eastern Europe. And that will be the typical designation of what takes place after World War II until the collapse of communism beginning in 1989. So, as early as the spring of 1945, the Soviet Union began installing puppet governments in Central and Eastern Europe. This is Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, which had been divided, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. And they slowly but surely will remove all political parties, except the Communist Party, create secret police forces like that which existed in the Soviet Union, and they will take control of intellectual and cultural life. Now, those Europeans who opposed this were exiled, silenced, executed, or imprisoned. And so it was an iron-handed policy. Well, what should we have expected from a megalomaniac like Joseph Stalin, other than just exactly what we got? He had been brutal on his own people. Why would we expect him to treat other people any differently? So, the Soviet Union supposedly helps themselves out by putting these governments in place, arguing that the United States had done the same thing, that they had a friendly government in Western Germany, that they had a friendly government in Italy and in Japan. Actually, we were occupying these countries. But this was the Soviet argument. And so by 1947, 2 years after the war is over, the relationship is ice cold. Hence, the Cold War. The U.S. could no longer trust the Soviets, so Truman united all the armed services together in the Department of Defense. Now, we've actually created a new branch of government as well. We have the Air Force. During World War II, it had been the Army Air Corps. Now we have a separate branch known as the Air Force. And all of this is for defense of the United States and defense of Western European nations against perceived Soviet aggression. And so the Soviets start building military strength and try to create tension between the various capitalistic countries. And as the Soviets begin to build up, so do the United States. We're not going to back down. Truman's not that kind of guy. And so an arms race begins. Now, communism has proved itself to be an inherently unstable system. And an advisor to the president, a man named Kinnaman, will argue that if we leave them alone, ultimately it'll collapse. And eventually, this was proven true. But it took almost the rest of the century for that to actually come about. So, Kinnaman calls for firm and vigilant containment of the Soviet expansion techniques, and this will become the Truman Doctrine. We've talked about the Monroe Doctrine, we've talked about the Roosevelt Corollary. Well, the Truman Doctrine is we are going to contain communism in any way we can. And of course, making a statement like that is obviously going to bring someone to the forefront who's going to want to challenge that. And that will come sooner rather than later. So the U.S. is going to support free peoples, and we're going to try to contain communism in any way we can. Well, the Soviets come in, and as they take over these Eastern European nations, they don't do a whole lot for them. They don't do a lot of rebuilding. They just kind of rock along and control things. Well, following World War II, in the spring of 1947, with most of Europe broken, shattered, and desperate, and of course factories, railroads, bridges, all of these things are destroyed, people needing jobs and everything else, Secretary of State George Marshall will probably come up with one of the most effective American foreign policies that has ever existed. It will actually be called the Marshall Plan, and it will call for massive financial and technical assistance to rescue Western Europe, in contrast to what is not happening in Eastern Europe. And as I say, it will be one of the boldest plans America's ever come up with, especially since the winter of 1947 was one of the hardest Europe had suffered in many, many years. And so it was intended to reconstruct European economy, neutralize communist threats, and build up secure foreign markets for American products. And it did succeed. From 48 to 51, the book says the Marshall Plan worked as hope, and prosperity returned to Western Europe. There were communist parties in France and Italy. As a result of the Marshall Plan, both of those lost ground, and Western European democracies united in unforeseen ways. And so it brought these freedom-loving Western independent nations together. And ultimately, we will have what will be called the European Union. But there will be other things occur along the way, including NATO, where these Western European nations bind themselves together as to oppose Soviet communism. So, as these Western nations draw closer together, it increased tensions, obviously, with the Soviet Union. Now, as I had noted, Germany was divided up. Originally, it had 4 sectors. It had an American, a British, a French, and a Soviet. Ultimately, the American, the British, and the French will come together and form what will ultimately be called West Germany. And the city of Berlin, the capital, what was left of it, will be divided east and west. Now, the idea of political unification in Western Germany infuriated Stalin. So he wanted to keep Germany weak. And so in June, he ordered the Soviet army occupying eastern Germany to stop all traffic into West Berlin. And ultimately, he set up a total blockade. They will ultimately build a great wall, and those in East Germany then are totally sealed off from the rest of the nation. But Berlin had some people that were Westerners, that were loyal to the Western ideas. And so the U.S. will actually begin an airlift that will go in and provide food and supplies to West Berliners. And this Berlin airlift will be the first major victory for the West in the Cold War. But Germany will emerge from all of this as 2 separate nations. And so, communist East Germany, capitalist West Germany. Now, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, as I called it, was signed by 12 nations. And here was that unity coming together. The United States, Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Norway, and Portugal. Greece and Turkey will actually join. And West Germany and ultimately even Spain will join. And this will become the largest defensive alliance in the world. Well, by joining this, obviously U.S. isolationism is dead. And this is the first long-term military alliance between the United States and Europe. And by the way, it still exists today. Of course, the Russians are not going to stand for that. And so they will take all of their little communist states and unite them together in a pact that will oppose NATO. And so in 1947, the Defense Act will come along, and we will have a National Security Council come along whose job is top specialist in international relationships who will advise the president. NATO still exists today. This National Security Council still exists today. And we will even then create a national security agency that will provide surveillance of individuals who are considered to be potential threats. And this will include not only people of foreign nationals, but it will even include American citizens. Well, Palestine had been a British protectorate since 1919. And following the end of World War II, many survivors sought to seek entrance into Israel's ancient homeland. And so, as they did, it was putting a lot of pressure on the British. And so finally, in 1947, the United Nations, which also came out of World War II, decided to divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. Now, the Arabs immediately viewed this as an act of war and attacked the Israeli settlers, and a war will begin. But in 1948, the United States, along with Great Britain, will officially recognize the nation of Israel. And believe it or not, the Soviet Union did. Not sure why, but they did. And so an Arab League of Nations will form with Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt invading Israel. The Israelis will do very well considering the circumstances, and ultimately there will be an uneasy peace. And as a result of this invasion, the Palestinian Arabs will basically lose everything. Now, let's make a point. Why do so many Arab states hate Israel today? Here is your basic reason. They say these Arab Muslims were evicted from their land and Israel took their state over. Now, one thing I want to point out is how totally hypocritical this attitude is. Yes, the Palestinians lost. They had nations come in to aid them. They fought a war, and they got whipped. So, yes, they lost. But the interesting thing, these other Arab states, they're crying and, oh, it's so terrible and it's so horrible. None of them offered any of the Palestinians a place in their nations to come and live. And so to me, the whole argument is a totally hypocritical thing. Oh, you were so mean to the Palestinians. Well, what did you do for them? And the answer would have to be either silence or nothing, because they did absolutely nothing. Now, there will be sporadic warfare between Israel and the Arab states, and that even continues till today. Well, Truman's primary goal after the war was to be able to moderate the economy. Yes, we've got to keep military production up and we've got to keep military production going, but we need to have a transition to a more peacetime type of economy. And the one thing he wanted to do was prevent prolonged unemployment. You know, a lot of times after you've been in a wartime economy, and we discussed some of the many achievements the United States made during that wartime economy, one of the big fears is that as you begin to tool that back, that you go into a recession or something. Now, Republicans and the conservative Southern Democrats will balk at most of Truman's efforts to either revive or expand New Deal programs. And during the 1946 congressional elections, many middle-class voters will return to the Republican Party and turn much more conservative. Women, sadly, many of them who had been involved in defense jobs will be shoved out as men took off their uniforms and came back to their jobs. The federal government will hold on, though, to a few of the new deals. One will be Social Security benefits, and then the government will do something for this multitude of American veterans. It will be called the GI Bill. What this will enable former soldiers to do is return to school, including college that is paid for, train for jobs. Many will return home. They will marry. There will be what is called a baby boom. In fact, we will have a whole generation of Americans that are called baby boomers as a result of this. And so basically from 46 to 64 will be called that baby boom generation. Now, biggest problem is going to be a spike in price for consumer goods. And there are going to be quite a few strikes. And so to begin to control things, Truman will take federal control of the coal mines, and he will seize control of the railroads. And of course, these two rather shocking events will shake up some things in other industries, and they'll begin to pay attention themselves. Now, labor unions will come out of the war with more power than ever before. And as I have noted before, labor unions will tend to vote Democratic. And so Congress will, as a result of a lot of the changes that are taking place, and of course that Republican ascendancy, Congress will wind up rejecting a lot of Truman's proposals. There was a lot of discontent in the middle class and business executives, especially over striking labor unions. But the Second World War had changed America's racial landscape. Of course, many blacks had served in the war, Tuskegee Airmen among many others. And so the Soviets had a little propaganda thing they used. They said that America's racism, especially in the South, compared to the Nazis' treatment of the Jews. Now, perhaps that was a tad harsh, but Truman is going to appoint in 46 a committee on civil rights to investigate the racial violence that is going on and discrimination throughout the country. And then in 48, he is actually going to ban racial discrimination in the government, and he will end, by executive order, racial segregation in the Army, in the military. And so where we have had white units and black units, that is no longer going to exist. When individuals enter the military, they'll go to boot camp together, they'll train together, they'll wind up serving together. And that distinction is done away. He will reach out to the black community with expanded Social Security, with public housing, with education, and with health and insurance. And then in 1947, as these tensions are beginning to be addressed and coming to a head, of all places in America's game at that time, a change comes. As the season opens, the Brooklyn Dodgers, yes, not the LA Dodgers, the Brooklyn Dodgers, will have the first African American to play Major League Baseball. Now, there had been a black professional baseball league. And the individual that is selected is a young man named Jackie Robinson. Now, let me say some things about him. Number one, probably no better choice could have ever been made. Now, Jackie Robinson is going to experience violence, abuse, prejudice. Sometimes he's not going to be able to travel in the same railroad car with his team. He's not going to be able to eat at the same restaurant, not to be able to stay at the same hotel. There are even going to be professional teams that almost refuse to go on the field because he is there. He will receive death threats. And yet, this young man will hold his head high and persevere. There have actually been 2 movies made about him. One was much earlier, and he actually played himself in the movie. And then more recently, a movie, number 47, was made to kind of modernize the story for a more modern culture. But Jackie Robinson was an amazing player and person. And he possessed a certain dignity that will make the transition, as difficult as it was, just a little bit easier. And ultimately, because of who he is, he will win over many fans with his courage, wit, and talent, and he will quite honestly become a very, very popular player. So, a seam has been opened up, and a lot of people are going to begin to pour into this seam as time goes on. But again, let me say, probably no better person than Jackie Robinson could have been chosen for this change. And he did a masterful job. Well, after the war, in the far west, Mexican Americans still feel the prejudice. So just because we've won a war and just because we've won a racist war doesn't mean all racist attitudes and positions just suddenly vanish away. By the way, racism is actually something that is learned. And we can learn not to be racist if we will. So, for the first time in U.S. history, in 1947, the U.S. Supreme Court accepted the idea of a wall of separation between the church and the state. Now, may I say, this is not in the Constitution. It was not intended by the First Amendment. First Amendment simply said government cannot establish a religion. It did not state that government was anti-religion. But beginning in 1947, and it's going to go into the 50s and 60s and onward, the Supreme Court is going to become more and more anti-religion in its stands and in its positions. For example, in 1947, through the 50s, even into the 60s, the typical school day began with the Pledge of Allegiance, with a Bible reading, and with prayer. That was the typical start every day. And the Supreme Court will ultimately do away with two of those freedoms: the Bible reading and the prayers. And of course, those who claim agnostic or atheistic positions have attacked prayer in every way they possibly can. Let's take it away from football games. Let's take it away from schools. They want to take it away from government. By the way, the Congress of the United States has a chaplain. You should read some of his prayers sometimes. He does not mince words. Quite honestly, I'd love to meet the guy. Just by what he has to say in his prayers, I have a whole lot of respect for him, because he kind of, through prayer, tells Congress how it is. They don't necessarily listen, but he's saying it. And so this is going to be happening. Now, there are some who defy. There are still places where high school teams will get together and the team will have their prayer, or there may be a student-led prayer in the stands before the ball game. Our state and local governments around here have prayers before their meetings. But there are many who would love to do away with this totally. And all of this began back in 1947. So there is going to be this systematic chipping away of these American freedoms and long-term honored traditions. The Democratic Party, by the early 50s, has basically split into two groups. You have the Southern conservatives, and they will be known as Dixiecrats. And quite honestly, in the 1950s, there is going to be a revival of harsh racial attitudes and feelings, especially in the South. And then the other part of the Democratic Party will be a left-wing part of that party. And that party, quite honestly, has gone further and further and further to the left. And as the Democratic Party has moved further to the left, if you will check recent elections, you will find that the South ultimately abandoned the Democratic Party and went into the Republican Party. So that leftward move, somewhat started by Roosevelt, has continued and progressed. It will have a big dose of left movement in the 60s. And of course, since the turn of the century, there has been a decisive left turn on the part of the majority of the Democratic Party. Now, as we come to the 1948 election, the Democrats are going to go ahead and go with Truman, but they really don't think he's got a chance, especially with his civil rights ideas for all people. And so the Republicans come up with a very interesting individual by the name of Thomas Dewey. And you will actually have a rebellious Southern Democratic Party meet in Birmingham, Alabama, and they will nominate an individual named Strom Thurmond as a civil rights or states' rights Democratic ticket. And this will ultimately get them the name Dixiecrats. Now, normally, when a political party divides, you can expect it to lose. But interestingly enough, this did not happen. But everybody expected it so much that literally there were newspapers who published that Dewey had won the election before all the election results were in. And as it turned out, Truman won. In fact, there's a very famous picture of Truman holding up a newspaper declaring Dewey the winner. You know, there's a lesson here. There's an adage. Don't count the victor until all the votes are counted. And in this case, it proved to be true. I think this is probably very true in the last election we had between Clinton and Trump. You had the mainstream media that was just so sure that Ms. Clinton was going to win that when Trump actually won the election, they were totally shocked and did not know how to handle the situation. And so there have been a few elections like that that have really, really shocked the American people. But what of Truman's fair deal does wind up being accepted is basically only extensions of ideas from Roosevelt's New Deal. Congress will reject several civil rights bills. They will reject national health insurance. They will reject federal aid to education. And they will reject a new way of subsidizing the farmers. And so what is going to happen is the fair deal will actually become important about a decade later in the 60s as a lot of those ideas begin to ramp up. Okay, let's leave the U.S. for a minute. In 1949, as I mentioned earlier, there will be a communist uprising in China. And the communists will win. The U.S. will continue to recognize the old nationalist government that flees to Taiwan. And so now we have another major communist enemy in the East, in the person of China. Now, interestingly, early on, Russia and China tried to cozy up a little bit. But just as the relationships between the U.S. and the Soviets had soured, eventually a lot of the relationship between the Communist Chinese and the Communist Soviets will sour as well. But in 1949, the whole arms race changes. The Soviets detonate their first nuclear bomb. So now we have two nations in the world, ideological enemies of one another, threats to one another, on edge with one another, and now both of them have developed nuclear weapons. And as a result of this, a new fear and probably legitimate in some ways paranoia will begin to arise in the world. During the 50s, there will be literally bomb drills in United States schools. Kids will learn to go to the hallway like we do to protect from tornadoes or something, or they'll learn to get under desks. People will build fallout shelters and store them with goods and supplies in case they have to go underground and live. And this nuclear buildup will become so bad that people will actually create what is called the doomsday clock. And they will see how close to midnight and the total obliteration of human life on earth will come. And quite honestly, during the Kennedy administration, these doomsdayists are going to say the clock is at 11:59. We'll talk about this in a little bit. But it's going to get really close. And we'll see why those tensions build. Well, by 1950, at least the U.S. and Russia were kind of in a stalemate. But in Southeast Asia, everything is turbulent. And so tensions between North and South Korea finally erupt into a civil war. Now, Korea had been divided in 1945 into a Soviet and a U.S. zone, with both fully armed and hostile toward each other. And complicating that effort was the fact that there were Soviet troops in North Korea. And so the Soviets organized a communist government. The Americans counter by helping a democratic government in the much more populated South. And in June of 1950, a Soviet North Korean People's Army invaded South Korea. And they literally drove the South Korean army down the peninsula in a headlong retreat. Without consulting the Joint Chiefs or Congress, Truman will decide to wage war through the backing of the United Nations rather than seeking a declaration of war from Congress. So notice the technicalities here. Technically, we didn't have a Korean war. It was a Korean conflict. And it is the first military action authorized by the United Nations. So, the United States will wind up providing the largest contingent of troops, although 16 other nations will join the U.S. So, as the decimated South Korean troops are barely hanging on, General MacArthur will instigate a surprised amphibious landing behind the North Korean lines and will drive a wedge into the North Korean army, and as a result, the North Korean army will have to flee in to North Korea. But MacArthur becomes overconfident, and as UN forces are moving toward the capital of North Korea, China decides to get involved. And in November of that year, 300,000 Chinese volunteers will vow to liberate Korea, drive MacArthur into the sea, and they will counterattack and send the U.S. and UN forces back down into what is now South Korea. And so this Chinese intervention that, quite honestly, MacArthur had dismissed totally caught him unprepared. And so the UN forces will rally, and basically they will come to a point that they'll almost be at a line where the two nations had existed before the war ever began. Then MacArthur begins to get insubordinate toward the president. And let's realize that the President of the United States is the commander-in-chief of our military. And so he will be accused of insubordination, and Truman will make a difficult decision. He will remove MacArthur. Now, at that time, MacArthur was the Army's only 5-star general. And this will heavily divide the country. Republicans in Congress will protest, but MacArthur will not back down. And so finally, in June of 1951, the Soviets propose a ceasefire along the 38th parallel, that original dividing line. Truce talks will start. They will drag on for 2 more years. Generally, they are totally unproductive. Now, a truce will never, or a peace treaty will never be signed, and Korea will remain divided. Basically, an armistice agreed to restore the states to status quo. More than 33,000 Americans will die in this police action, as it is called by some. And in some ways, it did contain communism, because South Korea did not become communist. Technically, we are still at a state of war with North Korea. No treaty has ever been signed. And President Trump, quite honestly, has been the first president that has engaged in any kind of serious activity with North Korea since these events. So, what happened? What's the result of this? Well, the Korean War will actually create another Red Scare at home. We will start having loyalty oaths, and this will require federal workers to go through a background investigation to ensure they are not communist or even associated with communists. And for nearly 1/2 century, the Cold War will affect American life as national security begins to rise to the front. I mean, there will even be faculty members in colleges that are checked out. Now, in 1953, Dwight Eisenhower will revoke this loyalty oath. But as this Red Scare comes up, it is believed that Hollywood was the hotbed of communism in the U.S., and that it was leading to a lot of anti-American activities and there will be a full-blown investigation of the Hollywood setup and under all that went on. Ultimately, we will have 11 top leaders of the Communist Party in America being convicted, and they will be convicted of conspiracy to overthrow the government. Okay? In the 1950s, the FBI unearthed the existence of a British-American spy network that had secretly passed information about the development of the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. And we also found out that the Soviets very much had spies in the United States. So here goes the paranoia all over again. And a Republican senator named Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin will emerge as the most ruthless manipulator in the nation's anti-communist anxieties. And he will literally ignite a reckless crusade that smashed the idea of fair play and free speech in the United States. He went on an old-fashioned Salem witch hunt and never uncovered a single communist agent in the government. But that's how paranoid things are. That's how paranoid America has become. Now, would-be immigrants to the United States that come from countries where there was a totalitarian government wind up being barred from admission to the United States. A repressive atmosphere of fear developed. States and localities required these loyalty oaths that Truman had begun, while supremacists, including the Klan and others, used this as an excuse for further demonstration. Now, both Red Scares did wind up violating the civil liberties of many individuals. Universities barred left-wing speakers. They fired teachers who refused to sign the loyalty oaths. And some of these teachers just simply refused to sign out of sheer spite. Not that they were communist sympathizers, just out of sheer spite, I won't do it. The FBI will develop files on thousands of U.S. citizens, and this idea of loyalty became an idea of conformity. You fit the pattern or. And so fears of communism at home did grow because of a patchwork of Soviet spies, but it will develop into a politically motivated paranoia. Sure, both nations had spies. Both nations were watching each other. We didn't trust each other. What else would you expect in a situation like that? Now, although Americans applauded Truman's integrity and courage, they were disheartened that members of his administration were inept and corrupt. The Korean War brought higher taxes and higher prices for American consumers, and of course, they blamed the president for their frustrations. So Truman left the White House in early '53. When he did, the Cold War was definitely an accepted part of the American way of life. But toward the end of Truman's presidency and during the early '50s, the economy of the United States began to grow at what would become the fastest rate in U.S. history. And it would totally transform social and cultural life. White Americans are going to be moving to the suburbs, leaving the blacks trapped in declining cities. And this is going to bring along the early 50s, or the decade of the 50s, which is normally called the American Decade. This is a time when there was affluence, a time when living in the U.S. was good for many people, and yet underneath there were some problems and contradictions and difficulties. And so while some are enjoying the new prosperity and so on, others are not. By 1959, 2 out of 3 Americans will say that the possibility of an atomic war was America's most urgent threat. And so, as we talk about this economy, let's think about something. As the economy surged, by the end of the decade of the 50s, national income will have doubled in every measurable way: diet, housing, income, education, recreation. Most Americans lived better than their parents had. We have some new innovations coming along: TV, air conditioning, dishwashers, jet aircraft. And so all kinds of things are changing that are helping make America a different place. And while America is having all of these innovations and all of these great things are going on in America, they're not happening in the Soviet Union. And so there is a very, very stark contrast between life in the 50s in America and life in the 50s in the Soviet Union. So when we come back next time, we'll talk about some of these growths and a new president who's going to make some interesting changes in America. Students, hope you're well, and please, 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 keep yourself safe.